Hello, everyone. I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, there is an empty chair at our table tonight as we mourn the loss of our friend and colleague, John Maginnis. We will look back at his career tonight. That career was all about analyzing the news, and we will do that too as we discuss Ray Nagin seeking a delay, the latest from the legislature, a reporter called to court, and big-name Republicans come to town. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources, Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, Gordon Russell, managing editor, The New Orleans Advocate, and Stephanie Grace, columnist, The New Orleans Advocate. And Stephanie, we're going to start with you because the legislature is just about winding down in this session. So, when does it end, and what has been accomplished?
Okay, the easy part first. It ends Monday, 6 o'clock. It has to by the terms of the Constitution. They're pretty much done at this point. There's not a lot that's left hanging. I think I have to revisit a comment that our good friend John Maginnis made years ago about the legislature that applies again this year, and that is, overall, this legislature could have done less, but they ran out of time. Wasn't very active. There was a lot of debate, obviously, about a lot of interesting issues. Not a lot of big legislation. Mm-hmm. We passed a budget that passed today, so there's a $25 billion budget that relies, as usual, on some money that not everyone is sure will materialize. There's another amnesty program that they actually put one in place last year, and it was successful. But there's always the question of whether there's more money there to be gotten. You had some legislators talking about relying on unicorns and fairy dust and things like that.
It's always good to rely on that.
Exactly.
Maybe count on it.
The governor had a pretty light agenda. He's had very heavy agendas in the past. This year, there's some human trafficking legislation that was passed that he's trumpeting. Mm-hmm. A few other things, really not much. Obviously, we know his attention is elsewhere. In New Orleans, there are a couple of big issues that were resolved. One is the lawsuit it's the New Orleans area, by the Southeast Levee Authority, that the big lawsuit against the 97 oil and gas companies. The legislature did say that that cannot go forward, basically. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean it's over. I think they will go to court and say that the legislature can't retroactively kill it.
Can you explain that really quickly? I mean, that essentially it deals with jurisdictional standing. That's what this
it does.
legislation would do.
Whether this particular type of authority has the right to file a lawsuit. There were some other lawsuits that they left in place, even though there was the oil and gas industry would hope to kill all of them, I think. These are the ones that were filed by parishes. Yeah. And I think politicians kind of said, we don't want to touch that. But the fact that this is an appointed board and has different, it's kind of formed under different authority. Again, it's not over. The Green Army is vowing to challenge this in court. It's interesting. You had a lot of lawyers who voted against this, who the argument really was, if it's a bad lawsuit, then the courts will throw it out. That's where the decision should be made. But obviously, the oil and gas industry is very, very powerful in the state, and this is proof of that. In New Orleans, Mayor Landrieu had some success with his attempts to find ways to raise new revenue. Probably not the one, the bill that passes is probably not his preferred one, I'm guessing, because it means he's going to have to go to citizens and ask for a big property tax increase. He had tried to get a cigarette tax increase for the parish only. That failed, and he had also tried to get some additional hotel-motel taxes. Lieutenant Governor Jay Darden really fought him in that, and he, was running for governor, anti-tax, so that ended up
And the argument against the hotel-motel tax was that it would prevent us from getting the Super Bowl, and we didn't get the Super Bowl.
We didn't get it anyway, so why not? Yes.
Right. So this will be an increase in millage dedicated to fire and police,
Fire
right?
and police, and it's interesting. It won't take very long because I think they want to fast-track it, but because it's a constitutional issue, voters statewide first have to approve it. Voters statewide and in New Orleans have to approve it, and that will give the city council the right to call an election, and then there will be a referendum again in New Orleans.
So there's a few steps.
So there are a bunch of steps, and it's a lot of money. I mean, he got the authority to ask for up to 10 mills each for fire and police, up to $28 million. It actually would not be subject to the homestead exemption, which is kind of interesting. Don't know whether he's going to go that high. Everyone still remembers the Audubon election, of course.
Well, voters never have an objection to voting for another place to pay taxes.
Right, or the tourists,
or
the people
so
who
that
smoke.
part's
They know
easy,
they
okay.
be doing it anyway.
But the part will be getting the locals
exactly.
too. Yeah.
So the vote will first be for the state, and then before council to put it on the ballot, and then or people of New Orleans, the folks of
So the
Orleans
first
Parish.
election is supposed to be November.
Yeah.
A lot of things that we talked about a lot did not happen. There were no reforms to the Tulane scholarships that Gordon has written quite a bit about. The legislature didn't change Common Core. They might end up pushing it back a little, but it's basically in place. We didn't make any changes to TOPS, the tuition program that a lot of people think is not sustainable. That's been pushed off. Obviously, nobody voted to accept the Medicaid money that Governor Jindal won't take as part of the Affordable Care Act. Didn't really deal with the fact that the Obama administration has rejected the formula for funding the private hospitals, so that's a big issue. The administration says, "Oh, we probably have this. We're appealing," and the legislature, they have their fingers crossed because it's potentially a huge budget hole.
So a lot of big issues still before us, but the session wraps up
Exactly.
this Monday.
Yes.
Okay, thanks a lot, Stephanie. Gordon, over to you. Our former mayor, Ray Nagin, sought and got a delay in his sentencing. What happened with that?
Well, there's a couple developments this week. The two major ones. One is that his sentencing got pushed back 3 weeks, which is really no big deal. I think that the judge was inclined, it's Judge Ginger Berrigan, I think she was probably inclined to just give him the time because his lawyer objected to, he said he needed more time to read a pre-sentence investigation, which will make a recommendation on how much prison time he should get. And I think she figured he's going to go to jail for a pretty long time anyway, and why not give him another 3 weeks to be totally prepared. So that was, I guess, a small victory for the mayor. He had a setback as well, which was that the judge also ordered him to pay $500,000 in forfeiture, which means the government can seize and sell the Nagin family's assets, or at least assets belonging that he has some ownership in. And that, that could hurt. His wife recently declared bankruptcy, which offers her some protection against this sort of thing. Like when you're in Chapter 7 bankruptcy, your home can't be seized, but actually this forfeiture thing, I'm told, kind of overrides that, and the government can actually seize your house. That's going to be enormously complicated and take some time. It's really unclear how many assets the Nagins have. The sense that we have is that they're fairly broke, but they do have a couple of things like a home and probably some assets, and this will allow the government to sell some of those. So
He also had legal fees, which I imagine is pretty high.
those, I mean, I imagine some of his debts are to his lawyer, Robert Jenkins, and then this doesn't mean that he won't also be subject to a restitution order, which might be another $500,000. The $500,000, by the way, I should say, that was the amount that the courts determined were ill-gotten gains as a result of this corruption scheme that he was convicted in, and so that's what he has to pay back.
So would they be able to also go after him for restitution?
They can.
Could
I
it
mean,
be more?
restitution is much less draconian. Typically, they come up with a schedule for paying back things on restitution, and it's sort of limited by your ability to pay. So it might be a couple $100s a month or something, and there's no expectation necessarily that you'll ever pay back the restitution. Whereas the forfeiture, they take everything you have and try to make good on the debt. So
Is he appealing still?
yeah,
We talked about that.
Jenkins, his lawyer, has said he's going to appeal, and I don't know what grounds there are for appeal, but I mean, I'm sure there will be an appeal. No one I've talked to seems to think there's anything really murky about the case. And in terms of the sentence, people are saying, people who are familiar with sentencing guidelines expect the guidelines to recommend a sentence in the range of 15 to 20 years. Now, the judge can do whatever she wants. She has a reputation for being maybe the most liberal member of the bench over there, but people also say that she tends to be more sympathetic towards defendants who she thinks really have not had a chance in life. People who came up through a terrible school system and so on and so forth. And I have no idea how she regards the former mayor, but she might be inclined to cut him less slack than she has cut other people.
Okay, go ahead.
Hasn't the whole internet commenting issue been already tested in this case? Is there a possibility that could surface again?
I mean, it could be part of the appeal, but it was tested in this case and rejected by Judge Berrigan, who said the way that we're going to correct for that. There were a few comments made by Sal Perricone, the former assistant U.S. attorney, about Ray Nagin that were inappropriate, and she said the way that we're going to cure that is by making sure that nobody in the jury pool is familiar with those comments and so forth.
All right, Gordon, thanks a lot. Over to Stephanie
Yes.
again, and we have a big meeting going on for Republicans
Yes, down
in
at
town.
the Hilton. It's called the Republican Leadership Conference, and it's the Republican Party, but it's really the conservatives in the Republican Party. It's not officially Tea Party, but there's a big Tea Party element to it. They're meeting for 3 days and opened last night. The two featured speakers were Bobby Jindal and Phil Robertson.
Duck Dynasty
You
fame.
think Bobby Jindal wants to be the Louisiana guy who gets exported, and it might end up being Phil Robertson because he was the star of the show. Sarah Palin helped introduce him.
Yeah, he
She was in
even
town.
overshadowed Sarah Palin.
He kind of did,
Yeah.
yes. But Bobby, it was interesting. Other speakers include Donald Trump was today, Ted Cruz, the Texas senator, the Tea Party senator, is tomorrow. All the Republicans running for the U.S. Senate are going to get a chance to speak, and U.S. Senate here in Louisiana. There was an interesting speech today by Haley Barbour, the former governor of Mississippi, which was kind of against the grain with this group, where he stood up and he said, Ronald Reagan, who you all idolize, he compromised every day. Remember that, because this is really the uncompromising part of the party. And but Jindal,
How did his remarks go over? Did he say-
this was not the crowd for that. It was some tough love, I think. It was interesting to see Bobby Jindal in this circumstance because he is, this is one of his national speeches, but we actually got to see it here at home. So he touched on a lot of the things he's been talking about a lot. Certainly religious freedom, that's been a big theme of his lately. Healthcare. Common Core, he kind of took a detour. It sounded like maybe it was unscripted, but there were a lot of people talking about Common Core, and so he weighed in and he just declared outright, I am against Common Core, which, remember, if you go back a year ago, he was a supporter, and he spent about a year inching his way back. That's a big issue with this crowd. He talked about Benghazi, he's hitting all the big issues, the VA crisis, certainly. It was a good speech. I think sometimes people here in Louisiana forget that he's a very effective stump politician.
And speaking of that stumping, did he address at all his seeking the presidency?
He was asked directly by one of the out-of-town reporters, and he said, we are certainly thinking about that. And I'm not sure I've heard him say certainly before. Remember, he used to say, I have the job I want, and then he switched, he moved over to we're thinking about it. So this was a certainly thinking about.
So step by step, we're
Yes.
getting a little bit closer to certainly saying it.
Exactly,
Okay,
yes.
Stephanie, thanks a lot. Gordon, over to you. And I know you're busy each week covering the news, but you were also part of the news. Not that you necessarily wanted to be.
Right. Yeah, kind of a strange proceeding this week in federal court where myself and another advocate reporter, John Zimmerman, both of us who used to work at the Times-Picayune, were subpoenaed to testify in a court hearing involving the federal case against Telly Hankton and members of his family who are accused in a big racketeering conspiracy of murder and various other things. The case kind of nominally revolved around Hankton and his co-defendants were seeking to have their indictment thrown out on the basis of an article that we published in the Times-Picayune shortly before the indictment came down. And the indictment, the story had some references to unnamed sources and some things that were expected to be in the indictment. Their argument was that this was proof that agents of the government had been leaking things to the media and that the case should be thrown out as a result. They also wanted sanctions against 3 FBI agents who were involved in a meeting with myself and John and another reporter a few days before the publication of the story. So those agents had to testify as well. And the judge decided not to throw out, it was Judge Martin Feldman, federal judge, decided not to throw out the indictment and not to sanction the agents. But first he conducted an evidentiary hearing in which they were exploring the question of what exactly did these agents say during the meeting, and the defense attorneys wanted to question John and I about other sources for the story, and that was sort of where there was a First Amendment issue where they were the judge had to weigh the rights of the accused against the First Amendment, and our view, very strongly held, was that when we grant a promise of confidentiality to people who talk to us, we have to uphold that. And we were a little nervous about this hearing for that reason. The judge limited the questioning basically to this meeting that the FBI agents had with us and did not allow questions. They repeatedly tried to ask about who else did you talk to for the story, and the judge didn't allow that line of questioning, which I thought was wise of the judge, and I thought it was a victory for the First Amendment and a victory for reporters' ability to protect confidential sources.
So with this ruling, does this really put this issue to rest as far as you guys are concerned?
I certainly hope so. I think they'll appeal, and I don't know that they may, that could go somewhere, but I think that's the end of this part of it. I mean, this is another kind of outgrowth, I would say, of the commenting scandal at the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I think that one reason this proceeding ever even happened is because the lawyers for Hankton and his co-defendants are sort of drawing on this general perception of misconduct by the government, which some judges believe had gone too far, and so that led the judge to even open this door in the first place.
And maybe using the press to kind of taint juries.
Right. I mean, the broader argument the defense bar makes is that the government has been using the press to sort of poison jury pools for years, Yeah,
well, but the judge did not buy that argument in this case. At any
Right,
rate.
correct.
Okay. All right, thanks a lot, Gordon. We're going to talk now about our good friend John Maginnis, who, with great sadness, we're sad to say, and he passed away this past weekend. Errol, over these decades now of informed sources, John has been there and telling us about what's going on in state politics. I mean, he was the dean of Louisiana politics.
Yeah, I think it really played an important role in the history of this show, because in the early days of the show, I really think he helped it gain a lot of credibility. He knew so much about Louisiana politics. He helped this show prove itself, and I always thought that politics was one of the strong points of this program. And conversely, this program helped Maginnis establish himself, get known in the New Orleans market. He was somewhat known in Baton Rouge, but getting known in the New Orleans market. He developed a column first with City Business and then with the Times-Picayune. So I think that John Maginnis and this show really kind of grew up together. He always had to see that the far left, if you're facing the moderator, that was always it'll always be the John Maginnis seat. Right. Of him, I could say that he was the best there was. There was no better political commentator than he was, certainly not in Louisiana, perhaps in no other state. And he made the decision to be a small businessman, and that he had a small independent news service with his LawPolitics.com. Had he, as a young man, struck out and gone to New York and tried the national press, he certainly had the talent and the skill to be at the national level and to be a big name at the national level. And certainly as a television presence, as a talking head on television, he's better than anybody that you see. And so he was a real talent that we were lucky to have pretty much for ourselves in Louisiana, and just a big loss. I think part of what he offered is he was so good at explaining complex issues, and he did it in a folksy sort of way, and he didn't have an agenda. He was just explaining the facts, and always had a bit of humor to it also, and so I think it was really good. And what we're going to do is we have a clip. Actually, it's only from a couple of weeks ago when he was on this show. And we're talking about the legislative session, and we're talking about the issue about the levy boards and the lawsuit. And out of the blue, I just asked him a question about term limitations. I thought it'd just be like a quick exchange, and it developed into a whole thread, into another discussion. And Gordon was on the show, and Dawn Ostrom was, and so you'll see in the clip. But I think what's good about this is just looking for his style, how smoothly he moved into another topic without hesitation, and how knowledgeable he was. This is totally unrehearsed. This is something we just moved in, and you still see elements of his wit and his knowledge.
All right, let's take a look at it.
The transitional phase of term limitations is over. As someone who's watched the legislature, what impact is that having in the legislative process? Are you losing like these long-time powerhouse type players now, and are you having more greener people?
Yeah, they're not as interesting. They don't say the darndest things. Like those old guys usually they didn't let it rip. They didn't care, and it seems like the new legislators are a lot more self-conscious about saying anything. And true, it has. I think, and ultimately, it's made the administration and the governor more powerful if that was possible. And also you feel, I think even among voters, there's a less accountability toward legislators because they don't feel the same threat to someone running against them, because most possible competitors out there feel, I'll just wait this guy out. You know, he'll be term limited next time, I'll run down. I'm not going to oppose him now. So it's and it's created this thing, a dynamic where you have legislators always looking for their next step. And now you don't see guys who are going to be in the House for 20 or 30 years. They know they got to move on somewhere. So they're looking at moving to the Senate, or even in the case, there's a lot of talk about Senator Ed Murray looking at running for the House. He started in the House, he ran for the Senate, now he might be running for Jared Brossett's seat now that he's moved on to the council. Murray won't confirm that, but that seems to be the political talk.
Yeah, I think you're going to have more interim council members, legislative members, because of legislators seeing a chance to run for something else, and
then that opens up
opens
up a seat. And so
it seems to me there's less familiarity with your legislator than there used to be. I think just because it changes so much.
You don't have just some of the old. You're right. Some of the old names were there that everybody knew quite well. So it has changed the feel of it, but it hadn't all been term limits. I just think there's a more conservative legislature when this governor putting in a lot of ethics reforms have kind of changed the social scene at the legislature somewhat, probably overdue. The legislators, I think, are happy. The lobbyists have been kind of happy because they were getting bled by some of these paying for entertaining legislators. They don't quite do so much anymore. So that whole scene has changed somewhat, but it's still, there's still a lot of interesting characters there.
Has it given the lobbyists more power, given that they don't have term limits?
They seem to know the legislators will rely on them probably even more for information.
Anyway, you could just see his style and all the information, purely spontaneous conversation. I just want to say quickly that I talked to his office. His office says, we knew he had some maladies, and he was suffering from a blood disorder that apparently that his body hadn't taken to. He had the heart problems before. And there were times when he came to the show, and one time in particular, he looked a little tired, and I asked him about it. But once the show started, he was there. He was pumped up, and he was and he was pumping just like he was right there.
And this is who he was. I mean, there was no onstage, offstage John Maginnis. If you sat down next to him at the legislature, that's the conversation you'd have, and he'd be smiling like that, and he'd be telling stories and just sharing so much wisdom. But wonderful man.
He always had such a fantastic command of everything. And he could just weave it in, and people genuinely liked him, and you can see why. I mean, even though I think a lot of the tributes to him after he died were that, even people who he wrote a lot of critical things about said that they really liked this guy. And that's, as a journalist, that's a real tribute to a journalist, when people can still, when you've been tough on someone and they can still say you were fair to him and you were a nice guy.
Even Edwin Edwards said that, I believe.
Yeah.
Yes.
They respected him. They respected him for the journalist that he was. And just taking a look at that clip, you could see the brightness in his eyes when he was talking about this. I mean, he was really happy talking about politics because he loved it. He loved learning more about it and telling us about it. You could just see that in him.
And he also had his books. I think the 3 books, and what Cross the Bear, about the
which I still have Stephanie's copy of.
And I get it back.
That book I would put that book up
fantastic.
there among one of the best political books I've ever read. I mean, as you said at the beginning of this, he's a guy who could have gone any place, and I think that book proves it. I mean, it's as good a work of political reportage as you'll read, I think. I mean, it's just
fantastic. No, he had great characters. This is the book about Edwin Edwards
An
and David
Embarrassment
Duke
of Riches,
and Buddy Roemer. But boy, it just reads like a novel. It's
really well done.
But it's true,
Yes.
and he doesn't embellish. He doesn't exaggerate. He just reports so beautifully.
Yeah.
And I mentioned that he could have been a national level reporter. He chose not to be. I mean, he was born and raised in Baton Rouge, and so he was fascinated, but he loved New Orleans, spent a lot of time in New Orleans. He and his wife had an apartment in the Quarter. Loved the scene, loved the bar at Two Jacks. They should be doing that. But even though he was not a national reporter, he was someone that the national reporters relied on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That he was a frequent source, especially when there was a big story out of Louisiana.
Well, as Marcia said, he really was the dean of Louisiana political reporters, and I know every time somebody passes away, people say there's no one like them, they
Right.
can't be replaced. But there
This
really
is
was,
true.
he really was a giant in this field, and there's a lot of great political reporters in Louisiana, Stephanie Grace being one. But this guy, when you look at the length of time he was doing this and the breadth of his knowledge and covering the whole state, I mean, there really isn't anyone else like him.
I always check myself against him. If I said something similar to what he said, I felt good. If we said something different, I went back and I said, okay, why do I went to kind of prove my work to make sure I really understood it.
Well, he is definitely going to be, and is already sorely missed. We're coming to the end of this legislative session, and you know, it would have been really great fun to hear him give his take on the wrap-up of the session.
This will probably be the first time in the history of the show that a legislative session ends without John Maginnis.
Yeah, I mean, that's really true.
You know what I'm
Errol,
talking about.
because
So
he has been a constant on Informed Sources, so we're certainly going to miss him. We want to offer our sincere condolences to his family and to his friends and to his colleagues, and we thank John very, very much for everything that he gave us here at Informed Sources. Okay, guys, it's time for us now to look ahead.
Well, speaking of John, toward the end, he took on a partner named Jeremy Alford at his Law Politics Weekly, and Jerry Alford is going to maintain the standard. They're going to keep it, and he's going to do the column, and I think probably his column might be carried locally in the Picayune. So, what John started will be carried on by that name and by Jeremy Alford. We'll probably be having him on the show.
No, good. I
worthy
look forward to
successor.
that. That's good. Gordon.
Okay.
Well, I wanted to mention two other, they're of course in great health as far as I know, but two other newsmen who are very well known in this town who this is their last day on the job, Dennis Woltering and Norman Robinson.
Right.
So I wanted to give a shout out to those guys who are a couple of the more best known faces and long-time great anchormen in this town.
And there's
Enjoy your
memory there.
retirements.
There's always the danger of losing memory.
That's right,
Yeah.
Stephanie.
Well, over in Mississippi, our neighbors are having a big Senate election on Tuesday. It's a primary for the seat held by Thad Cochran, the very long-time senator who has a very boisterous Tea Party challenge. Sarah Palin, some other people are challenging him. So this is, there have been a lot of these around the country. This is one of the big ones, and it's Tuesday.
All right, Stephanie,
Okay.
thank you all for being here, and thank you guys for joining us. And we're going to say one more goodbye to our dear friend John Maginnis. It's coming up right after the credits, so be sure to watch. And thank you for joining us again. We want to see you next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.